please help me welcome Anil Dash, co-founder of ThinkUp.
Century, doing something mean to it, do it better than anybody you ever seen do it.
You got like that
Kanye, I appreciate
little
that.
Kanye, 2 seconds
Yeah.
of Kanye there. It's probably all
It's
we can
about
handle.
the right amount. Too much more would be too much.
We might get a rant from him though because we didn't play it long enough.
Right.
Well, welcome, Anil.
Thank you.
This is fantastic. Look, this is an exciting day actually. So we just introduced some new data, new research. But look, you got a new startup.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us really quick what's happening with the startup, what
Sure.
it is, and then we'll jump in.
Just about to announce, first time ever, the launch of.
Can we get Anil louder?
You get a little louder. All right, I'll shout if I need to. Doing a new company called ThinkUp. So we're doing an app at thinkup.com that the idea is you connect all your different social networks, whether it's the Facebooks or the Twitters of the world, to the app, and it's going to coach you almost like you have an athletic coach about how to use those networks better, but at a personal level. So I think the statistics and analytics tools, we have great tools for.
Right.
Right. If you want to measure your engagement, measure your brand impressions, there's really great tools. But at a personal level, or even just a human level, whether you're an individual or a company, there's a sense of what's meaningful online, and that's really where we're focused. And so for about a year, we've been working with an open source community to build this app up. And the idea is that anybody, whether it's, like I said, the biggest company in the world or an individual, be able to sign in and say, okay, did what I say mean something to somebody? Did it make them laugh? Is there a connection of somebody nearby that I can sit down and meet up and talk with? So everything's separate from the statistics side of this thing is much more about, at a human level, am I really making a meaningful connection in all this time that I spend on my phone?
All right, I got a question for the audience in the back. Can you hear him okay?
All right.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I'm kidding, I'm kidding. Kevin, can we give him some sweetness on the mic, please? All right, so let me hear a quick test.
Sure. I don't know if we can. Any better now?
No?
No?
Todd, can you get that taken care of for Anil as quickly as possible? I think they're raising my voice, not his, which is always a good thing. But look, when we sat in Boston and you were telling me about, wow, that is me that they're raising up. Oh, let me just bring that down. When we sat in Boston and you were telling me a bit about ThinkUp, you actually brought a really human way of telling that story about reading to your son.
Yeah, I've got a toddler who's about 2.5 years old, and I read to him every night when you go to bed, like you do. And I realized doing the math pretty recently, I've spent more time since he was born reading my Twitter timeline and my Facebook feed on my phone than I've spent reading to him. And I'm not proud of that. Like, I'm not excited about that. But I think that's true for a lot of us. I think a lot of us spend a lot of our time on these devices. And I'm not one of those people who say, oh, that's evil and these are a distraction and we should throw them all away. Like, I'm not a Luddite. My life has been enriched by being on these networks. I've built businesses on these social networks. I know they're powerful. But we need to balance it and say, was it worthwhile? Was it meaningful? Can I go when he's a couple years older and he says, Daddy, why were you on your phone all the time? And tell him a reason why. And that's the big question to be answered, because that chart about how many followers and fans you have is always going to go up and to the right. Unless you do something really wrong, it's never going to go down. So you don't need to worry that much about that. As much as you need to worry about, is the time I spent on this network worth it? And did I do something I'm proud of? And can I look back a year, 5 years, 10 years from now and say, I'm proud of what I created, I'm proud of what I shared, I'm proud of the connections I made, and I've got something that's bigger than just, did we get a bounce in engagement on this range of dates?
Right. I think that word you used earlier, value, is something that we should explore, right? Because I think from a societal standpoint, it's interesting to see how many people will judge value differently. So for example, I know several folks who will take a selfie or publish their dinner, and then get frustrated because they didn't get enough engagement.
Right.
And so they'll find another excuse to trigger an opportunity to share. So to many people, we're getting caught up in the idea that value is about these engagement metrics, which is not unlike what a lot of brands are doing here in terms of judging success.
Well,
so what's different?
I think...
See if that's any better.
Woo!
Is that better? Yay! All right.
Let's start all over again.
Yeah. Well, no, I think actually this is the core thing that people need to hear, which is the networks give us tools for measuring a really, really narrow set of behaviors, right? So if all you have is likes and replies and retweets to measure how you're doing, that's the game you're gonna play. And well, as an individual, if I share a picture at dinner, there are people that care about it. There might only be 10 people in the world, 5 people in the world that care about it. But what then I want to know is, did it make them smile? Did they think it was funny? Was it meaningful to them? Was this one of the things that stuck with them of, gosh, I got to try that restaurant out? Those are all meaningful things. But if the only tools we have are in our brand impressions dashboard, then there's a disconnect. Right? And so that's the thing, is that there's a whole nother set of things that we can respond to and engage with and use as a meaningful metric that are not about the numbers and the charts. And that's not to dismiss. I mean, I use every stats and analytics tool out there. I think they're all great. I just know that we need something else that's going to talk about what was the impact I had, and even simple things of like, did you, Foursquare gives you badges when you check in somewhere. They don't give you badges for whether you checked into doing community service or volunteering in your community versus going to a bar. Those are both important things. Do both, but there should be some measure of like, well, this actually had a positive impact.
All right, so you've been at this since about 1999. I think you've been running dashes since 1999 consistently. So you're considered to be a pioneer, not just in social, but just in disruptive, a lot of interactive and conversational technology and media. So look, what did you see early on that you think is still part of the problem today? And what can we as individuals learn about that?
There are so many parts of the social web that we looked at 14 or 15 years ago, and we thought, for sure somebody will solve this by the year 2000, and we haven't solved it yet. And I think some of the key things there are being able to remix in interesting ways the content's coming out there and be able to work with it. So you look at, how many of you in the room have ever made a PowerPoint presentation and pulled some images off of Flickr? Like pretty much everybody, right? And it's really easy to go and you search, you click a tag, and you can find this stuff, because Flickr was kind of from that era, right? It's a 10-year-old app, and they had that idea that you should be able to go and search for photos you can reuse. It's really hard to do that with Instagram. So we have 10 times as many photos, or maybe more, being posted to Instagram as Flickr, but we can't reuse them. They're sort of not part of culture. So that idea that people will be able to reuse, repurpose, remix, reshare each other's information, I think that's really fundamental. That's where so much of creativity comes from. Similarly, the idea that we'd have a little bit more control. I think Rebel Mouse is here, and they do a great job of letting you put your content on your site. But until the sort of the return of those kinds of tools, we went from 15 years ago on the side of a bus or in a billboard, it would say, find us at AOL keyword Acme widgets, right? And then we briefly had a period where we said, find us at our website, ourcompany.com. And now we've returned to find us at Facebook keyword Acme widgets. Right, so we can assume there's a cycle here, and at some point we're going to go back to our websites, and if we've only been building up our relationships through all these other networks, there's going to be a missed opportunity, right? And it's not to say don't use them, but make sure they're both part of your strategy, make sure they're integrated together. That idea of there being a pendulum, there are cycles to this, that they repeat, that's probably the biggest thing that's been missing, is people, you go out to Silicon Valley, and granted, there are these 23-year-old kids that just got out of college and go straight into Google or Facebook. But the reason they don't know the cycle shifted is because they were in 4th grade the last time that the network worked like this, right? So I don't expect them to know, but I expect us to know and to think about, okay, when the change comes, how's it going to impact my career? How's it going to impact my company? How's it going to impact what I've done and what I've shared? And then maybe, and this is a little touchy-feely, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things that was interesting about a company like Flickr in the early days, or a lot of these different apps, was you sort of rooted for the company because you knew they were looking out for you. And I contrast to, as much as Facebook is an incredibly powerful platform, they just made these changes about graph search. So everybody that had opted out of being included in graph search, they said, well, only a single-digit percentage of our users had opted out, so we're just going to let everybody into graph search, and you can find anybody on Facebook. Now, a single-digit percentage of 1.2 billion users could be 100 million people, right? So they just said to 100 million people, you expressed a preference about not being findable here, but that's a rounding error to us, and it's not that compelling or interesting, so we're going to flip the switch back for you. there should be some accountability there.
Yeah.
This isn't saying they're evil. This isn't saying don't use Facebook. It's just simply saying if 100 million people have indicated that this at least expression of privacy is important to them, then a company should be accountable. And that's actually something you can build a company around. That's something we're looking at with ThinkUp. I think there are a lot of indie web companies, like indie rock bands that are saying the way we do it matters as much as what we do.
Look, I think one of the things that I appreciate is that that's the way it should be. One of the things that I've learned along the evolution of the social web has been that almost things that I would anticipate almost everything seems to be counterintuitive, right? And that just I'm an analog first guy. I mean, I'm old enough to remember what it was like to change a channel with a knob on a television. And now you have digital natives who define sort of the idea of privacy, discoverability really differently. So how they look at the world is different than how I look at the world.
Sure.
Yet I'm the one making decisions about investments, technology direction, and I might be off base. So I guess this is a long way of getting to the question of businesses are looking at all of this technology in the same way, realizing that their customer is getting more digital,
Right.
but not necessarily understanding that there's sort of behavioral patterns behind that. They're jumping on the trends, they're increasing investments, like you said, in terms of now find us on Facebook, find us on Twitter. What are brands missing in all of the scurry towards this technology?
I think there's a real reflexive way of looking at the shifts in culture and judging them as if they're good or bad. So we talk about, millennials like to take selfies or whatever, the kind of the broad statements people like to make. And then it's really easy to just make the joke at their expense. And I think brands sort of say, well, we have to check this box. We have to give them a tool which they're going to take selfies with without thinking about why.
Right.
Without thinking about how it maps to the broader issues in culture. So I think the thing a brand can do really sincerely is say, how can I be of service? Right? How can I help these people do what they want to do? And I think that's not a new idea, but the difference is for us to not look at it condescendingly, right? So I look at something like selfies and I think, why is there not quantified selfies tools, right? Like we take it seriously enough to get off the couch. I have this Nike Fuel Band, and it'll track how many steps I take, but there's no way for me to know, well, I took a photo of myself wearing a blue shirt. Last week I had one in a green shirt. Which one looked better to friends? Which one did they like better? Right? Because we don't take it seriously. This is how I'm expressing myself. Because I'm a middle-aged dude with a kid, so I'm not the target audience. But somebody that's younger, that's an important part of them defining themselves. That way of thinking about these are legitimate expressions, even if they're unfamiliar to us. So people always want to say, oh, these kids are just looking at their phones all the time, and how come they're never, why don't they read a book? And we talk about with kids, we talk about screen time. And I'm like, I don't really care if my kid reads a paper book versus an iPad book. And I think that's the lesson for brands is we have to check our own biases about having come up from the analog era and when the remote control was like, my dad smacking me in the head and telling me to turn the knob to, okay, these are legitimate changes in culture. They are as important as, for me, it was like I got into rap music in high school and that was the rock and roll of our generation. I was like, oh, these kids today are crazy. And I think the same, in the 50s it was rock and roll and this was their kind of thing. These are just cycles and they are legitimate and real, and we have to not look at them as an obligation of like, well, we got to deal with this, but instead be excited about like, this is what's next, this is the future, and we can really help amplify it.
I like the word you used in terms of utility earlier. I mean, it's a complicated word, but I also tie it back to value, right? So if one thing that we've learned about sort of the digital native is that what they value and how they define success is not how maybe you and I grew up defining success or how our parents define success. So we look for things outside of, I guess, we look for things to be more meaningful and helpful and something that can become part of sort of our lifestyle and a form of self-expression. So when I look at brands and how they're adopting new technology, it's almost like they're taking these conversational tools and they're doing what they've always done. Sort of just
very much so.
Giving you a message, albeit a creative way, ways that spark engagement and conversation. But what do you think businesses could do better to understand what the value system of this customer?
So there's a big question about how we define success, right? And right now success is really inwardly focused, right? We generate a report for the CMO and the number, like I said, the chart goes up and to the right and the number is bigger than it was last month and that's success. And we don't have any ways to say for a new generation of users, and I don't think it's just by age, but obviously by sort of, by behavior, We don't have a way to say for this new generation of users, we provided them something that resonated and that was meaningful and that they found important. Because there's not a number attached to that, right? And I think that's a really hard thing, and I don't say it lightly. I'm not saying this is easy. I think this is a really big, hard problem to tackle. But how do we find a way for a lot of people to say, this organization, this company, this brand, whatever it is, this person, helped me fulfill what I want to be? And I mean, we've been reflecting on that, where I've been part of, big companies and little companies and startups and the successes and failures. And in doing a new company, I kind of looked around and I've seen folks go from, I'm like, oh, that guy has a crazy idea and I don't think it'll ever work, to, being the household name, big billionaire tech companies, and like, I'm happy for them. And then, if I'm doing a new company, I'm thinking, is that the goal? Is that the trajectory? And that actually isn't the thing that's most meaningful, right? I'm here, I'm lucky, I'm doing well. When we actually were at this conference and we were talking about this initiative around clean water that Charity Water does. I look at where I come from, my family in India, a family of 4 in that area lives on $600 a year. My dad got clean water to his village when he, actually in the late 90s, so not 100 years ago. This is a recent thing. So by any measure, because my kids got vaccines and food and water and all these things, we're good, right? Everything else is bonus. And to be, that difference between being merely successful, as everybody in the room is, and insanely successful is not that interesting, right? So the thing a company can do is not, we're going to get you from being merely okay into being, Kanye and Kardashian, but instead to say, you do you. If what's meaningful to you is you expressed yourself in a new way, or you found a way of, presenting yourself to the world, or finding something that's meaningful, there is a role for business to play in helping to enable that. And that right now is not part of the conversation because it's not something we measure, it's not something we track, and it's not something we talk about. And I think we can actually make a little bit of a step towards saying, alongside the metrics we track, alongside all the other numbers and reports we can do, let's take a little bit of the narrative of the individual stories of somebody we impacted and say, we also made this happen.
All right, so I'm going to ask you one last question. I want you to knock this one out of the park.
See what I can do.
There are a lot of us who are experimenting and being very public about digital detox.
Yeah.
Just kind of unplugging for a bit, maybe not checking Twitter, maybe not checking Facebook. And one of the things that I hear from you, and I see what you're doing with ThinkUp, is it's not about unplugging. It's about changing perspective, right?
Yeah.
And so I want you to leave us with, as human beings, and then also as people responsible for brands, how could a detox actually help us change perspective?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I grew up in Amish country, and you want to talk about digital detox, right? These folks know how to unplug. And the reflexive thought is they just shun all technology. But they don't. What they do is they think really, really hard about what happens if I use this tech every day. How does my life change? How does our community change? So the thing we can do, I've unplugged. I don't think it's as valuable as saying, what am I doing every time I put my thumb on this piece of glass in my hand? And what we can really do and come away with are really simple questions. It is, if this is how I'm going to spend 3 or 4 years of my life, that's what the math shows. We're going to spend 3 or 4 years of our lives with our thumbs on our smartphones by the time we die. If I've spent 3 or 4 years of my life with my thumb on this phone, what do I have to show for it? What are the things I will have cared to have done? And every single person I've talked to, from the top to the bottom, every single person I've talked to has said, I want to connect better with my friends and family. I want to help serve my community. I want to let people know who I was and what I cared about. And those are things you can do as the biggest company in the world. Those are things you can do as an individual. Those are things you can do if you're rich or you're poor. All we have to do is say it matters just as much as all the other things that we focus on and track every single day.
Man, beautiful. All right, guys, give a warm round of applause. Thank you so much, Neil. Excellent, excellent.